The blue light from the holographic display cast strange shadows across Captain Veltar's scaled face as he studied the latest reports from the Outer Rim territories. 300 years had passed since the last human warship had been destroyed, and the galaxy finally knew peace. The Hegemony Coalition now controlled what had once been human space, dividing the fertile worlds among 12 different alien species. Another dead colony cataloged in Sector 7, his aide reported, her voice carrying the boredom of routine work. No signs of recent activity. The plague species is truly gone. Veltar nodded with deep satisfaction. The humans had been like a disease spreading through the galaxy, jumping from world to world with their aggressive nature and frightening ability to adapt to any environment. Their complete elimination had been necessary for galactic peace and stability. On the mining world of Kepler-4 for 2b, massive automated extractors continued their endless work in what had once been human settlements. The Coalition had assumed these machines were simply leftover equipment running on ancient programming, slowly grinding to a halt as their systems failed. They never questioned why the mining yields had actually increased over the past decade, or why the extracted materials were processed with an efficiency that exceeded anything the humans had achieved 3 centuries ago. Deep beneath the planet's surface, far below the alien archaeological teams that occasionally visited, a man named Timon monitored the surface activity through concealed sensors. His weathered hands moved across holographic controls that would have seemed impossible. To the humans, the Coalition remembered. The technology was clean, silent, and completely invisible to the scanning equipment the aliens used. Beside him, a woman named Hai-Jin tracked the alien patrol schedules with mathematical precision, her dark eyes reflecting data streams that showed every movement in the system. She had been born in these underground tunnels, like most of the current generation, but her education far exceeded anything her ancestors had dreamed possible. "They're getting comfortable up there," Hai-Jin observed, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned to wait generations for the right moment. "The archaeological teams are requesting permission to expand their excavations into the northern continent." Taman smiled grimly, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Let them dig. They'll find exactly what we want them to find." The Coalition teams had discovered human artifacts just as planned. Old weapons that no longer worked, outdated computer systems filled with false data, and the remains of settlements that told the story the aliens wanted to hear. Every piece of evidence carefully crafted to support the narrative of complete human extinction. In the vast underground cities that honeycombed the supposedly uninhabitable moon orbiting the system's gas giant, millions of humans continued their hidden lives. Children who had never seen natural sunlight learned engineering principles that surpassed anything their ancestors had achieved. The survivors had used their centuries of enforced hiding to become something far more dangerous than they had ever been during the original war. The mining operations on 17 different worlds continued under alien supervision, never knowing that every extracted mineral was being carefully diverted, small amounts, never enough to be noticed.
Ow.
But over decades, those small amounts had built cities, ships, weapons that existed in the spaces between alien sensor sweeps. On the agricultural world of New Geneva, Coalition settlers had built thriving communities where human farms had once stood. They celebrated their harvest festivals in buildings constructed from the stones of human homes, never realizing that beneath their feet lay tunnel networks that stretched across continents. The humans who moved through those tunnels had learned to live in silence, to think in decades rather than years, and to remember everything. Tay-Min received a coded transmission from 17 different systems, each carrying the same message. The Coalition was planning something they called Phase 7 expansion, an ambitious project to settle the Outer Rim systems that had been designated as uninhabitable. Systems where human refugees still lived and breathed and planned to colonize the dead zones, Hai-Jin said, reading the intelligence reports that had been gathered by humans who had spent lifetimes integrated into Coalition society. Starting with the Kepler 186 system. No. Taman knew that system well. It housed nearly 2 million human survivors in underground cities that had been built into the planet's core. The Coalition believed it was an empty, worthless rock orbiting a dying star. They had no idea they were planning to build homes on top of a graveyard that was very much alive. "How long do we have?" he asked. 6 months before the first colony ships arrive, Hyjin replied. "The advanced survey teams will be there in 3 weeks." For 3 centuries, humanity had practiced the art of being invisible. They had learned to move through alien societies without being seen, to work in alien governments without being recognized, and to build technology that existed in the blind spots of alien perception. The Coalition had celebrated their victory over the aggressive expansionist species that had once threatened galactic peace. They had never realized that humanity had simply learned the value of patience, and that some things were worth waiting 300 years to achieve. The galaxy thought the count was over, but Earth had never stopped counting. Duhayan stood before the massive tactical display in the command center, watching the flow of Coalition ship movements across what had once been human space. The holographic galaxy rotated slowly before him, each star system marked with different colors that showed alien patrol routes, supply lines, and population centers. 3 centuries of careful observation had taught them every pattern, every weakness, every blind spot in their enemy's operations. The underground facility stretched 4 kilometers beneath the barren surface of what the Coalition had designated as Moonbase 07. To alien sensors, it appeared to be nothing more than a lifeless rock orbiting a gas giant. They had no idea that beneath the surface lay the largest human city in the galaxy, home to 15 million survivors who had never stopped preparing for this moment. "Report," Duhayan commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never known defeat because he had never been foolish enough to fight when the odds were against him. Sujin stepped forward from her position at the intelligence station. Her uniform bore no insignia that would be recognizable to the outside galaxy. The data streams flowing across her workstation would have terrified any Coalition military leader. The Coalition is planning Phase 7 expansion. They want to settle the Outer Rim systems, including 17 that contain active human populations. Duhayan studied the projections with the calm patience that had kept humanity alive for 3 centuries. Each of those 17 systems represented hundreds of thousands of human lives, communities that had grown and thrived in the shadows of worlds the aliens believed were empty. The Coalition had no idea they were planning to build homes on top of graveyards that were very much alive. "How many of our people are currently integrated into Coalition society?" he asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it confirmed. "Approximately 40,000 operatives across all 12 species territories," Sujin replied, her fingers dancing across holographic controls that displayed faces and identities. "They've been in position for an average of 30 years. Some have reached significant positions in government and military hierarchies." The integration program had been humanity's greatest achievement during the hidden centuries. Volunteers had undergone surgical modifications, psychological conditioning, and years of training to become perfect replicas of alien species. They lived entire lifetimes in Coalition society, having families, building careers, and gaining the trust of their unknowing neighbors, all while quietly gathering intelligence and preparing for the day when humanity would reveal itself. In the research laboratories that occupied the lower levels of the facility, Jinwoo made final adjustments to technology that would have seemed like magic to the humans of 3 centuries ago. The survivors had taken the aliens' contempt for human ingenuity and turned it into their greatest advantage. While the Coalition had grown complacent, believing themselves supreme, humanity had evolved beyond recognition. "The neural interface systems are ready," Jinwoo reported to his team of scientists and engineers. "We can disable their command networks from the inside whenever we choose. The beauty is that they'll never know what hit them." Yoon-soo looked up from her biological analysis station, where she had been perfecting countermeasures that targeted the specific weaknesses of each Coalition species and the species-specific protocols. "Perfected," Jinwoo replied with quiet satisfaction. "We know exactly how to neutralize each member species' natural advantages. 300 years of studying their biology, their psychology, their technology, they have no secrets from us anymore." The research had been painstaking and thorough. Every alien corpse recovered from old battlefields had been studied. Every piece of Coalition technology that could be secretly obtained had been analyzed and improved upon. Every cultural pattern had been documented and understood. The humans had become the galaxy's greatest experts on the very species that had tried to destroy them. Duhaon received the reports with the calm of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. His father had been a watcher, as had his grandfather before him. 3 generations of the same family had devoted their lives to this single purpose.
Understanding that.
Revenge was a dish best served with mathematical precision. Begin Phase 1 activation, he ordered. Alert our embedded operatives that the time for hiding is almost over. Across the galaxy, coded messages began reaching humans who had spent decades living false lives. A shopkeeper on Altair Prime, who had sold goods to alien customers for 25 years, received a simple numerical sequence that meant everything was about to change. An engineer working on Coalition starship designs got a message that told her to prepare for the revelation of her true identity. A bureaucrat in the Coalition Defense Ministry learned that the reports he had been secretly altering for years would soon become weapons of war. The Coalition had celebrated their victory over humanity for 3 centuries, building monuments to their triumph and teaching their children about the dangerous species they had successfully eliminated. They had divided human worlds among themselves, strip-mined human colonies for resources, and used human technology to advance their own civilizations. They had never realized that humanity had simply learned the value of patience, and that some things were worth waiting 300 years to achieve. The Watchers had been watching, counting, and preparing. The galaxy thought the humans were extinct, but the dead were about to teach them that some things could not be killed, only transformed into something far more dangerous. Admiral Kextara stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship Dominion, leading the largest expansion fleet in 3 centuries toward the Outer Rim territories. 57 ships, filled with colonists, terraforming equipment, and military escorts moved through space with the confidence of a species that had ruled the galaxy unchallenged for generations. The fleet's destination was a cluster of systems that had been marked as dead zones since the human extinction. Beginning final approach to the target system, reported the navigation officer, her tentacles dancing across the control panels. All sensor readings show normal space, no signs of technological activity or life signatures. The first sign that something was wrong came at 0347 hours, when the fleet's primary communications array simply vanished. Not destroyed by weapons fire, not damaged by system failure, but gone as if it had never existed. The backup systems activated automatically, then disappeared in the same impossible way. Sir, we're losing communication with the other ships, communications officer reported, his voice tight with confusion. The signals are just ... stopping. Admiral Kextara had fought in dozens of battles during her long career, but she had never experienced anything like this. Enemy attacks were violent, obvious things with explosions and damage reports. This was something else entirely, like having pieces of reality simply edited out of existence. All stop, she ordered. Full defensive posture. Begin deep sensor sweeps of the surrounding area. The sensor sweeps revealed nothing but empty space, the same readings they had been getting for weeks during their approach. But as the Admiral watched, her fleet's engines died one by one. Not shut down, not damaged, just gone. 57 ships found themselves drifting helplessly in the void. Their crews trapped inside vessels that had become metallic coffins, 20,000 light-years away. Minho watched the Coalition fleet from the bridge of the stealth ship Persistence. The vessel existed in the spaces between sensor readings, built from materials that seemed to bend the laws of physics and powered by technology that the Coalition could not detect or understand. Around him, his crew worked with a quiet efficiency of people who had trained their entire lives for this moment. All targets disabled, reported Yujin from the weapons station. No casualties reported. Life support systems are maintaining normal parameters on all Coalition vessels. Minho nodded approvingly. The old humans would have started shooting immediately, turning the engagement into a bloodbath that would have solved nothing. The new humans understood that death was just one tool among many, and often the least effective one. The real message came from what you chose to leave alive. "Open a channel to the Coalition flagship," he ordered. "Let's introduce ourselves properly." The Coalition crews found themselves trapped in their own ships, able to breathe and move, but unable to control any of their vessel's systems then. Impossibly, their communication screens activated with a frequency that should not have existed. The face that appeared was unremarkable, almost forgettable. Human. But not the savage warriors the Coalition remembered from their history books. J1 sat in what appeared to be a simple command chair. But behind him, holographic displays showed technical specifications that made the Admiral's engineering. Officers gasped in disbelief. The technology was decades ahead of anything the Coalition had developed, elegant and efficient in ways that seemed almost artistic. "Greetings," J1 said simply, his voice carrying no anger or hatred. "We apologize for the inconvenience, but we need to discuss your expansion plans." Admiral Kextera found her voice after several long seconds. "You're supposed to be extinct. We destroyed your species 3 centuries ago." "We got better," J1 replied with what might have been a smile. "Evolution is a wonderful thing when you have time to do it properly." The Admiral stared at the human face on her screen, trying to reconcile this calm, reasonable person with the aggressive warriors her people had fought so long ago. "What do you want?" "For now, simply to redirect your expansion efforts, Jay," said. "The systems you're planning to colonize are not as empty as your surveys suggested. There are people living there who would prefer not to be displaced." "Impossible," the Admiral snapped. "Our sensors showed no technological signatures. No population centers, no signs of civilization." "Your sensors show what we want them to show," J1 corrected gently. 300 years is a long time to perfect the art of being invisible. We've become quite good at it. Communication channel filled with data streams that made the Coalition's most advanced. Computers seem like children's toys. Star charts showing hidden installations, population figures for worlds thought to be barren. Technological specifications that redefined what was possible in the galaxy. "Your expansion fleet will be returned to Coalition space unharmed," J1 continued. "Consider this a gentle reminder that some systems are occupied by people who value their privacy. Future expansion efforts should take this into account." Coalition ships found themselves released from whatever had held them, their systems returning to normal function. But their sensor logs now contained readings that would terrify anyone who analyzed them. The humans had returned to the galaxy, but they were nothing like the species anyone remembered. As the Coalition fleet began its long journey back to report what they had found, they carried with them the knowledge that humanity had not just survived their extinction, but had used the time to become something far more dangerous than they had ever been before. Esiogen stood in the Coalition council chambers, but not as a prisoner or an intruder. For 25 years he had worked in this very building as Administrator Level 7 in the Resource Management Division, filing reports and attending meetings. That shaped the economic future of 12 different species. The alien leaders who now stared at him in growing horror had greeted him in the hallways, eaten lunch with him in the cafeteria, and trusted him with classified information about their most sensitive operations. "Another manufacturing world has gone dark," reported the Hegemony Prime Minister, his voice shaking as he read from the latest intelligence briefings. "That makes 17 systems in the past month. Our entire industrial capacity in the outer rim has simply stopped responding to our commands." "Not dark," Esiogen corrected quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the rising panic in the chamber. "Restructured. The facilities are still operating, but they're working for different management now." The 12 species leaders turned to stare at him with the dawning realization that the unremarkable human administrator they had ignored for decades was something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. His face was the same one they had seen in countless meetings, but now they saw it clearly for the first time. "How long have you been here?" asked the Coalition military commander, her voice barely a whisper. 25 years in this building," Siogen replied calmly. "But my people have been integrated into your society for much longer. We've been patient, learning your systems from the inside while you celebrated our extinction across the galaxy." Humans who had spent lifetimes hiding in plain sight began revealing themselves. On the military command station orbiting Proxima Centauri, Hyen-Su stood up from her desk in the Strategic Analysis Division where she had worked for 30 years. The alien officers who had relied on her tactical reports suddenly understood that their most trusted advisor was a member of the species they thought they had destroyed in the Economic Planning Commission on Vega Prime. Wu Jin removed the biomask that had hidden his human features for 3 decades. The trade ministers who had implemented his carefully crafted economic policies realized they had been following the guidance of someone whose people they had tried to eliminate from the galaxy. The coalition's strength had always been their unity, but that unity depended on communication networks, supply chains, and administrative systems that humans had been quietly controlling for generations. Transportation networks that moved goods and people across hundreds of worlds began routing cargo to destinations that served human interests. Manufacturing facilities continued producing the same items they had always made, but now those goods disappeared into distribution networks that no longer answered to coalition authority. Sang-Min's image appeared simultaneously on every communication screen in coalition space, from the smallest personal devices to the massive displays in government buildings. Behind him, holographic charts showed the true scope of human survival. Not scattered refugees hiding in caves, but a sophisticated civilization that had used its time in the shadows to become something far more advanced than what it had been before the war. "You declared us extinct 3 centuries ago," Sang-Min said, his voice reaching billions of alien citizens who had been taught that humanity was nothing more than a dangerous memory. "That was your first mistake. You stopped counting the cost of your actions. We never did." The coalition leaders watched in helpless fascination as their civilization crumbled from within. Every system they had trusted, every network they had relied upon, every person they had given authority to, had been compromised by an enemy they thought no longer existed. The humans weren't invading their territory. They were revealing that the invasion had happened decades ago. The coalition had lost without ever knowing there was a war. On industrial worlds that had been strip-mined for their resources, technicians who had worked the production lines for years began implementing changes that increased efficiency while reducing environmental damage. The alien supervisors found themselves locked out of their own facilities, watching through security cameras as their workers transformed mining operations into something sustainable and beneficial for the planets they had been destroying. Military bases discovered that their weapons systems would no longer respond to coalition commands. Supply ships carrying food and medicine to outer colonies found themselves redirected to worlds that had been abandoned or neglected by the coalition government. Communication networks that had connected the 12 species for centuries began carrying messages that questioned the official version of history and revealed truths that had been hidden for generations. The count stands at 47 species eliminated by coalition expansion. Sang-Min continued, reading from data that scrolled across displays throughout coalition space. 138 worlds strip-mined to ecological collapse. Approximately 12 billion sentient beings displaced or eliminated to make room for your member species. The coalition leaders sat in their chambers, surrounded by the trappings of power that had become meaningless overnight. They commanded fleets that would not obey, governed worlds that no longer acknowledged their authority, presided over an economy that had been restructured to serve the people they had tried to destroy. Humanity had returned to the galaxy, but they had not come back as conquerors. They had come back as accountants, and the books had been balanced. Dongjun sat across from the Coalition Council in their own chambers, no longer hiding behind false identities or working from the shadows. The most powerful leaders in the galaxy faced him with the helplessness of children who had finally encountered adults who understood how the world really worked. The ornate meeting room that had once been the center of galactic power now felt like a classroom where very expensive lessons were being taught. The count stands at 47 species eliminated by coalition expansion, Dongjun said, reading from data that scrolled across holographic displays that had replaced the Council's own information systems. 138 worlds. Strip-mined to ecological collapse. Approximately 12 billion sentient beings displaced or eliminated to make room for your member species. Ji-Hai stood beside him, her uniform bearing the insignia of the newly formed Human Coordination Council. The symbol was simple, elegant, and completely unfamiliar to the alien leaders who had spent centuries believing they controlled the galaxies. Destiny. Our count also includes 300 years of human lives lost. But we've learned that revenge is less effective than restructuring. The Coalition Prime Minister, a being whose species had ruled their home sector for millennia, tried to maintain what remained of his authority. You cannot simply dissolve our government. We have rights, treaties, legal frameworks that have maintained peace for centuries. You had those things, Young-Soo interrupted from his position at the tactical display that now showed the real-time status of every coalition world. Past tense. The frameworks you created assumed you would always be the ones enforcing them. That assumption has proven to be incorrect. The alien leaders looked around the chamber and saw the truth reflected in every surface. Their fleets hung powerless in space. Our economies operated according to human priorities. Their communications networks carried messages approved by human administrators. But their populations were unharmed, their worlds intact, their basic needs met. The humans had demonstrated the ability to destroy everything the Coalition had built, and had chosen reconstruction instead. Myong activated the new Galactic Charter, its terms appearing in every language and communication method known to the galaxy's species. The document was comprehensive, fair, and completely non-negotiable. The new count begins now. Every species gets representation based on population and contribution to galactic welfare, not conquest or resource extraction. Every world's resources are managed for long-term sustainability, not short-term profit. The Coalition military commanders studied the holographic displays that showed her fleets being systematically restructured. Ships that had been built for conquest were being converted into vessels designed for exploration, research, and peaceful contact with previously unknown species. You're dismantling our entire military structure. We're optimizing it, corrected Sang-Ho from his position. At the Defense Coordination Station, military force has its place in maintaining order and protecting innocent populations. What we're removing is the capacity for aggressive expansion and resource exploitation. The Charter continued to display its requirements in language that was impossible to misunderstand. Colonial worlds would be governed by their own populations rather than distant administrators. Resources would be shared based on need and contribution rather than political power. Scientific advancement would be collaborative rather than competitive, with all species contributing to and benefiting from new discoveries. Some of our member species will never accept this, the Coalition Economic Minister warned. They've built their entire civilizations around expansion and resource acquisition. Then they'll need to learn new ways of building civilizations. Dongjun replied without emotion. The galaxy has room for everyone, but not for everyone's worst impulses. We've spent 3 centuries learning to be better than we were. It's your turn. The displays around the chamber showed the scope of the transformation already taking place. Manufacturing facilities that had produced weapons were now building medical equipment and educational technology. Mining operations that had strip-mined worlds were being converted to sustainable extraction methods that left ecosystems intact. Trade networks that had concentrated wealth in the hands of a few powerful species were being restructured too. Distribute resources more equitably. You will adapt to this new reality, Dongjun said, standing with a presence that somehow filled the chamber despite his completely ordinary appearance. Or you will be removed from positions where you can harm others. The choice is yours, but the counting continues either way. Coalition leaders realized they were not being conquered in any traditional sense. They were being governed by people who thought in centuries rather than years, who had learned to value patience over aggression, and who had never stopped believing that every life, every world, every decision mattered enough to count properly. New galactic government would be staffed by beings from every species, but the humans would provide the mathematical framework that ensured fairness and sustainability. They had returned to the galaxy not as warriors seeking revenge, but as administrators, who understood that true power came from making systems work for everyone rather than just for themselves. The old count is finished, Jihai announced as the charter was transmitted to every world in what had once been Coalition space. The new count begins with everyone starting from 0. What you build from here depends on how well you learn. to add instead of subtract. Humanity had returned to the galaxy, and they had brought math with them. The universe would never be the same, but for the first time in centuries, it might actually be fair.